very long time. If you can imagine that when I was a young student, I was Greta Thunberg. So he allows us to pursue our individual passions in whatever spaces brought us eventually to Web3. In my case, it included environmental and human rights advocacy. And so I've picked up the so-called ESG mantle within the company on our environmental, social, and governance initiatives.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So a couple of words about myself. So my name is Alexander. I work for the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, which is part of the Cambridge Church Business School, University of Cambridge. My work is related to more the climate impact of the digital asset ecosystem. So what we are doing, we are trying to provide the information to the public that essentially helps them to, for instance, quantify electricity consumption of different networks, but also looking into emissions, and which is now, I think, quite specifically in the context of the EU an important topic, given that there have been MICA, which we will talk later about, where kind of disclosure requirements are mandatory, and kind of having, I would say, quite a granular and contemporary data available is just super important to make sure that the public has the best information possible. My background is more from traditional finance, but I have been a practitioner myself, so I was for some years in Bitcoin mining. I was a miner myself, and I think currently most of my work is related into the mining space. So possibly to start, let me set the scene a bit, so kind of in terms of research, how we got here essentially, and how these kind of concerns emerged. So I think, as we all know, everything essentially started with Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin uses proof of work, which has basically a security architecture dependent on electricity consumption, right, as a means to deter kind of malicious actors. So over time, kind of things changed, right? Mining, so-called mining, changed in terms of how it's being executed, where we really started with what's this grassroots movements where, you know, people running their own node, having essentially a mining node and full node at the same computer, using CPUs, mining. Then you know, some miners discovered GPUs as a means of mining, being more efficient than CPUs. And at some point, and I think this is really kind of where this environmental debate caught a lot of steam, when we started to see the entire mining ecosystem become a lot more professional, where we moved from the GPUs to actually this application-specific devices, kind of called ASICs. And there we started to seeing from essentially people building their setup in their houses, in their, for instance, backyard or their shed, to actually industrial scale.
Or connecting to their college's computer system.
Yes.
Late at night.
There have been reports in some universities that some students used basically a bit of free electricity to possibly gain a bit of mining exposure. And this is in the very, very early days. Kind of fun stories, but yeah, those are definitely out. And I think we are here in an Ethereum conference, right? So I don't want to speak too much about Bitcoin, but essentially when Ethereum went live, Ethereum also used proof of work. And so at that, basically by the end, close to around the time of the merge, Ethereum electricity consumption was about 25% that of Bitcoin. So it was really kind of a substantial load as well. And then we saw something that I think you all are aware of, which was the merge where we transitioned to kind of proof of stake, and that fundamentally altered the security architecture and specifically not requiring kind of the expenditure of electricity anymore as a means of deterring malicious behavior. And I think...
Can you take 1 second on that? Because in fact, Cambridge University and your unit were responsible for looking at Ethereum the week before and the week after the merge. And taking a look at what was accomplished, actually at great risk to the protocol. You know, the amount of money stored in the Ethereum ecosystem in the course of September of 2022 was huge, and all put at risk to essentially green the system. And you guys did the principal measurement. Do you want to just take a minute on that bit of history? Because you really were the leading spokesman on this.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So basically, I think the first work on this was done by someone else. We came a bit afterwards. But we did a very, I think, thorough assessment of Ethereum proof of work essentially historically, but also then proof of stake. And as you said, I think at that time around the merge, it was always stated mostly stated as this kind of changing a jet engine mid-flight, where, as you said, at great risk, you really fundamentally change kind of the how consensus is achieved by moving from proof of work to proof of stake. It was, I think, extremely well executed, right? If we think about the entire gravity of the ecosystem, so you not just have kind of the native token ETH, but you have an entire ecosystem, as we see here, built on top of it. So I think it was a really fantastic achievement of the Ethereum team. So our kind of, I would say, small contribution was try the assessment more from the climate angle, where we first wanted to understand historically what was electricity consumption of Ethereum when it was still proof of work, and in terms of emissions as well, and then kind of trying to contextualize this with how things have changed post-merge. And yeah, I think there we saw some very, very interesting findings where we could clearly see that we're talking about an entire different universe, right? So we, on our website, what we are doing is also kind of not just showing this final estimates, but also contextualize our results. So we, for instance, if you imagine the before the merge, the electricity consumption, and you compare it to post-merge, it is a 99.99% reduction, right? If you compare this to the London Eye, for instance, being the pre-merge consumption, and then you have the post-merge consumption the size of a raspberry. So to give a bit of kind of context here. So it was,
and also to compare it to other industries. I mean, we went from being a brown tech, essentially. I've had the privilege of representing the Ethereum ecosystem fairly much broadly at the United Nations for 6-7 years. We were a brown tech. People didn't want to talk to us. And literally the day after the merge, I think in the history, not just had we greened ourselves, but when you look at a 99.92% reduction in your carbon footprint, whether it's overnight or over 5 years, we did it overnight, in point of fact. But can you think of another industry that's come close to even a 30% drop in their carbon footprint in any reasonable period of time? I mean, 99% is literally unheard of, I would say, in the annals of environmental mitigation.
Yes, I mean, I think it is a very unique scenario that is not kind of replicable by any sort of other industry, except you, for instance, use, suddenly build your own generation infrastructure that is, let's say, wind farm with generation with storage, and you're kind of trying to green yourself in that kind of way. But if you have any sort of kind of heavy industry and green steel and those sort of things, but otherwise I can't really think of anything that's specifically in those kind of time frame to essentially shift the entire climate footprint to that extent. But yeah, I think it's a choice that the Ethereum community did, and personally I think it's for Ethereum it was kind of from the community also. I think the Ethereum community is also a bit different than from the Bitcoin community. Also, if you look about the networks, what is kind of the unique selling proposition of the networks, where Bitcoin I think is a very different narrative than Ethereum. So yeah, but that was very, very interesting, and it was something that we really enjoyed kind of looking into. So Stephen, the Ethereum Climate Platform, can you tell us a bit more about kind of what you're doing and generally how you look into kind of fostering sustainable innovation?
Great, thank you. Yes, as most of you in the room are aware, the merge in the fall of 2022 was accomplished by protocol teams all over the world, by and large financed by the Ethereum Foundation. The largest, I believe, of those dev teams was actually at our company Consensys and led by Ben Edgington out of the UK from our protocol team. And I actually had a chance to talk to, because I saw it happening in front of my eyes with my colleagues, I had the sort of instinctive belief that it was the devs themselves who were building the product who should own the product. So I started talking to Tim Byko at the foundation and Ben Edgington and other members of his team at Consensys who were actually building the proof of stake Ethereum. I said, okay, well, we're going from a heavily climate in negative intensive manufacturing process to a green process. What should we do now that we're a green organization? And almost universally, true to the engineering mindset, they all said, you know, we've just dropped 99% of your carbon footprint. What else would you like, Mr. Haft? And when we got done chuckling over that, the truth was they all had stories of why they were doing it for their kids, doing it for the planet, doing it for ready to end the narrative that somehow we who were trying to become the stewards of change in the planet really didn't deserve that opportunity to be stewards, because we were actually screwing the planet at the same time. So this offered us an opportunity to really sort of right the ship a bit in terms of what we are, not only as companies, but as a movement looking to forge a new path. And so what they did was they said, okay, if we're going to be green from here on as of whatever it was, September 16th, 2022, maybe one thing we could do is look back at the 7 years, 2015 to 2022 of Ethereum, and literally clean up our historic carbon footprint. No industry on this planet has ever done that successfully. And so what we did was we went to our friends at Cambridge and we asked them to take a measure of what that historic carbon footprint was. I believe it came out around 30 million metric tons over the course of the 2015 to 2022. And having the opportunity to make phone calls with and on behalf of Joe Lubin, who remains an influence in both in our movement, I went around to what we'd call the Ethereum ecosystem, to companies that aren't Ethereum itself and aren't Consensys, but companies that are built on Ethereum or Ethereum aligned or EVM aligned companies, and said, hey, how about if in this one space, this space of climate initiatives, we don't compete, not even as frenemies. We actually collaborate. And we managed to pull together a terrific list of companies across Web3 to come into what we call the Ethereum Climate Platform, for the purpose of engaging everybody's tech, everybody's initiative, everybody's resource collectively in looking at the 30 million metric tons and finding a way to address that history. This coalition was put together in the course of 23, and in the course of last year, we went about figuring out, okay, how does one do that? And I can report, I'm not officially reporting it in the sense that we will a little later this year, just prior to the UN conference at COP, make a formal announcement, but I can tell you that in the course of the last 12 months, we have managed to clean up 1 million metric tons of Ethereum's historic carbon footprint, with 1 million metric tons of carbon removals that we have acquired, and over the course of this year are going to start to retire on behalf of Ethereum.
Fantastic, thank you, Stephen, and very interesting. I think this shows kind of how this entire ecosystem can actually help to, or how blockchain technology can help to facilitate essentially, I would say, in that case, climate, but also possibly social good. So it's very, very interesting. Let me continue with a bit of a background on MICA, so we also capture slightly this regulatory angle for those.
And just a reminder, our friend, we know him well, our friend Joachim Schwerin, who was to have joined us but for the cancellation of his Düsseldorf flight last night, his title, I believe, is Principal Economist of the European Commission. And he is a principal author of MICA. So he was to have been sitting there. I feel a little bit like it's an Elvis concert and he's the bassist and I'm the drummer and that's all you got. But Joachim has a tremendous amount to say about MICA, having written it. But we're going to attempt to sort of fill in for him as best we can.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's true. So Joachim, I think, is really one of very, very involved persons in this entire, in many aspects, but specifically when around digital assets. So yeah, I'm trying to kind of substitute a bit and give you some idea about at least the environmental side of MICA. So essentially, I think it's quite known that the EU has generally a very strong objective of including sustainability in the decision making, in the regulations, and so they did with MICA as well, where overall, after MICA essentially went to work, we thought that there's crypto asset service providers. So if you're essentially considered by MICA as a crypto asset service provider, you need to obviously fulfill certain obligations, and one of those is, for instance, if you are, let's say, an exchange or a custodian, provide your customers, your clients, with information of, for instance, about certain indicators of sustainability.
Did anyone in this room, if I may ask, are any of you involved with a company that made a MICA submission this year? And therefore you're familiar with it, we got one. For those of you who don't know and who didn't go through the extensive questionnaire, there is, remarkably, I assure you they didn't do this in the US, remarkably there is a series of questions about your company's carbon footprint.
Yes, and there is also hard data that they require. This is a bit of how the relationship to us comes in, because we are kind of one of those, I think, entities that provide those sort of data, where you have certain mandatory indicators, you have supplementary indicators, and you have optional indicators, where for all tokens, what is required is information about electricity consumption. So that's kind of independent of any sort of the extent of electricity consumption. That's something that you need to provide for any sort of token offering. Same goes for white papers as well. When we go then more into this kind of supplementary side, this then really depends on the electricity consumption actually. So there is a threshold of about 500,000 kilowatt hours per year. And essentially, if for instance, even Ethereum is above that, and we have Solana, and naturally, if you look at proof of work, I mean, we are at different dimensions. So obviously there is reporting requirements here as well. And for those sort of tokens, or mostly native tokens, there is kind of more extensive information required. That goes from, for instance, the energy, the share of renewables, that goes from kind of metrics of per electricity consumption per transactions, emission per transactions, and those sort of indicators. So you are required to provide a bit more information. And then, yeah, there's naturally some optional indicators as well. So no one is independent of any sort of emissions or electricity consumption, can provide those indicators that go from e-waste, recycling, water use, etc. So there's a very kind of a large variety of different indicators they are looking into, or as if you are a CASP, when you're having services that require you to disclose these sort of things that you need to disclose. And yes, I think here overall, one of the key ideas of the EU was simply to kind of provide all the information, or the most extensive information possible to clients, to the public, so that they can then make informed decision and have some idea about, for instance, the also environmental externalities of, let's say, their investment. And I think to talk a bit about kind of what we are doing, and where the challenge is actually coming in when it comes to these sort of estimates. And this is mostly what we are facing, to actually create those estimates, where it's in most cases a decentralized network, right? So you don't necessarily know what anyone is doing where. It's interestingly, it's a bit, this kind of calculations, it's overall a bit less challenging, for instance, for Ethereum, because as soon as we have proof of work, right, you have kind of so-called mining nodes, and you don't necessarily know where they are located, because they usually connect with a pool server, so they're not connecting with the wider network. But for instance, Ethereum, when we speak about beacon nodes, you actually can obtain quite a lot of interesting information just from the communication between those nodes. For instance, where they're located, what kind of clients they're using. And that is quite interesting. That here, I think, in terms of Ethereum, actually there is quite good estimates when it comes to electricity consumption and emissions, because we also have a good understanding of how beacon nodes are are globally distributed. That is a lot more difficult for proof of work, specifically Bitcoin, because there you need to understand really where the mining activity is located and not necessarily where the full nodes are located, because that differs quite substantially, given that mining is a very competitive business, a very energy-intense business. So naturally you have mining in locations that offer quite an, I would say, an interesting environment for...
In this sense, I would say that crypto, broadly speaking, blockchain, broadly speaking, plus AI and data centers, who of course have just simply a huge amounts of routine business data running through them, but now also AI and blockchain added to that everybody's basically chasing about 5 cents per kilowatt hour pricing anywhere in the world. Some are chasing it with a bias toward more renewables in the mix than others are. But is it fair to say that like the Bedouins in the desert going from waterhole to waterhole, that we've actually seen, we saw almost a 75% movement, I believe, when China banned mining from China to, strangely, the US, but all in search of this magical, roughly 5 cents per kilowatt hour goal.
Yes, that's true. So it's a highly, and getting increasingly competitive business. So you see about 5 cents, but it really depends kind of on the operational structure. But yes, it's very, very low cost energy, and that drives specifically. And thanks for this because what we did very recently is we published, I would say, one of the largest reports on digital mining, but mostly focused on Bitcoin mining, where we directly worked with industry stakeholders. In the past, we worked also with mining pools and miners directly, but now we actually managed to create a report where we surveyed about nearly close to 50% of the entire Bitcoin network hash rate. So I think that was a really substantial sample, and it gave, I think, tremendously interesting insights, specifically when it comes to also climate aspects, operational aspects, so for instance, which kind of machines are used in terms of efficiency, in terms of brands, but then also what are the energy mix, for instance. Cost was also a topic, so we actually got a bit of an idea of what are, for instance, direct electricity costs, and that was where this kind of 5 cents, I think the median was about 4.5 cents, if you look at the company costs. But yeah, you have a very, I would say in terms of a very narrow range, where we speak about from about 2 cents to 7 cents, and that 7 cents being really the kind of maximum where we can see that specifically in mining, even if you have very efficient machines, electricity cost is just the main 80%, actually, also based on our survey. 80% of your operation expenditures essentially goes, cash-based operation expenditures goes into electricity. And that was, I think that if you're interested more in Bitcoin, I don't want to speak about too much about Bitcoin here, but if you're interested in Bitcoin, feel free to reach out later. I'm happy to share a link to the report, and I think it provides a lot of interesting information. But to move on, Stephen, I think you mentioned also the US, because the US in terms of energy is just really an energy hub. You have a lot of energy available, whether it's stranded renewables. When we think about West Texas with wind energy, naturally there is also in the fossil fuel space a lot of stranded assets. When we speak about, for instance, routinely flared gas that is just currently underutilized, and we see miners basically capturing those sort of opportunities. But it's not just Bitcoin mining. Also, when we think about AI, so more broadly speaking, kind of, also given the current situation in the US, so how overall is the current sentiment in the climate community, and is this currently a bit of the end of ESG, coming with this entire kind of demand from AI and compute, and the US really want to position themselves, at least the current administration, position themselves at the edge here to dominate this kind of field?
Maybe. The current sentiment in the environmental community, I would say, in the U.S. is panic. But I would urge, given that I'm the one on the panel today, I'd actually urge a somewhat different look at things, which is stay away from the news cycles and look at the larger forces at work here. One of the large forces at work, we've read probably too much about the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Keep in mind that in the end, this most influential individual in Donald Trump's life runs an electric vehicle company. And he runs an electric vehicle company which is literally an unprofitable company. Tesla loses money, except that every year they cash in $1.7 billion worth of carbon credits issued by the dreaded state of California, dreaded in Trump White House terms, issued by the state of California, and they sell them weirdly to GM and Ford. So without the sale of the $1.7 billion a year of carbon credits, there is no profitable Tesla. So I would venture to say that a little like the sort of Trump taco of things that are on again, off again, as we've seen fits and starts in this administration, I would look to a shift sometime later this year where you're going to find some considerable efforts to walk back some of the anti-green going on in the U.S. market. So that's the first thing I'll venture to say. Second of all, to the degree to which, and it's considerable, I mean, Biden was an extremely environmentally conscious president. We have now gone to an extremely anti-green president. Still, the pendulum doesn't swing true extremes, sort of tends to live somewhere in the middle, but still, the change is pretty profound. In the midst of this, Europe stays the course. And it isn't just a question of environmental, social, and governance public policy. As you know, so much of the environmental movement has played out more in the marketing departments and press releases than in actual change in industrial processes around the world. There's been change, but compared to what comes out of the marketing departments, it's less. However, in Europe, the demand for to have their own independent, as America backs off, the two players who are most likely to step into the hole left by America in global green are Europe and China. And to some degree, there's concern that it could be too much China for purposes of the West. So indeed, that even puts more pressure on Europe to step up, that China is the alternative. I would say at the same time that Europe has a fascinating opportunity because, as Alexander mentioned in the beginning of our talk, you cannot separate blockchain from AI because both live at data centers, right? You're hunting GPU, you're hunting ASICs, but at the end of the day, your data centers will be central to the future of both blockchain and AI. And everybody's trying to be the king of AI. Europe has a history of kings. You guys are not ready to give up this crown so fast to America, China, or anywhere else. And what this means in the end is that Europe's going to have to upgrade its energy grid in order to even be a player in the AI space. And if you're going to upgrade your energy grid, how do you do it in 2025 and 2026? It takes 5 years to get even a modular nuclear, so-called clean nuclear plant online and on the grid. Nobody's waiting 5 years to become the king of AI. It takes, an empty field and a lot of sun to start a solar project. I think what's going to happen, and we in particular the Ethereum movement, who do see ourselves as what Joe refers to as stewards of the trust layer of the planet, to earn that trust, I think we have an opportunity to put ourselves into this conversation that Europe is having right now, the world is having, but in particular we're sitting here in France and Europe is having, on behalf of a renewables future to power our industry and the, in many ways, aligned, certainly in terms of the energy grid story, aligned industry of AI. And now's the moment to do it. we're going to have a chance to speak up, speak in Brussels, in our national governments as well, and urge them on a path that will give us a future in blockchain through data centers, but at the same time allow AI to grow as, to some degree, we see uses of AI for sure popping up down that hall every day in relation to blockchain, but just AI for general purposes where nation states are competing heavily and have a choice right now. I mean, really right now, a generational moment, 25, 26, to decide what's this electrical grid going to look like in Europe in the coming years.
Fantastic, thank you, Stephen. Let me share a bit of, it was a very good overview, you actually already answered my follow-up question in the explanation. So let me share some statistics what might be quite interesting so that we understand a bit kind of the magnitude of what has happened in terms of the intensity of kind of the computational demand that we most likely, that we have seen and we will see specifically when it comes to AI. So essentially, if you look at kind of leading edge AI models, since 2015, we saw about a 6 to 7 times increase in training intensity every year. So it's really kind of an exponential growth of the computational demand here. And that naturally has significant implications on the entire underlying infrastructure, right? And as you said, there will be a lot of demand. I mean, we saw already kind of all these announcements about new data centers that are these hyperscalers where we talk about hundreds of megawatts or even at gigawatt scale, entire campuses. And the big question is here how they are being powered, right? Because we have a national grid, but I think in no country that I can think of, a grid actually can manage to onboard those sort of large-scale facilities. So what we will see, I think, is very interesting that you will see these campuses being powered by, a variety.
In only 2 countries in the Nordics, I believe, throughout the 27 countries of Europe, are there countries that have even 40% renewables in their grid system.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually quite a few countries. Some countries, sometimes less well-known countries that have a very renewable grid. For instance, we think about in Asia, there is a country called Bhutan. It's a kingdom, and they are essentially completely relying on hydropower. We see even in Africa, Ethiopia, for instance, with the Grand Renaissance Dam. Being heavily reliant on, and then as you said, like the Nordic countries, right? But even here in France, right? I mean, it's pretty much nuclear, so you have a very low emission intensity when it comes to generation. So there are some countries who have already, I think, very much decarbonized their grid based on kind of a sort of natural endowment when we think about like huge hydropower resources, but also when we think about here like France building essentially kind of infrastructure that is very low carbon intensity.
Can I make a suggestion? Because I'm seeing my friend off to the left. Is there a question in the audience that we can take before we get off? I see
please.
One off to the right there. I see 2. I love it.
Thank you.
We have time for 1. Yeah, we have time for 2. Okay, that's it.
How have you found the Ethereum community's attitude towards climate and energy sustainability?
How do I find it today versus 2022? How do I find it on in a more general sense, or
in a more general sense? So how willing to cooperate? How seriously do you think they're taking this?
Listen, you're talking to somebody. It's like we're talking golf, and I happen to have the privilege of playing with, I don't know, Tiger or Rory. I'm very lucky. I get to work with Joe Lubin every day. Joe Lubin does 2 things. He helps run a company called Consensys, as you know, but he helps lead, I think, the Ethereum decentralization movement more broadly. I find a tremendous sense of responsibility living among my colleagues for what it is we're bringing to traditional finance, traditional, the business case for the world today. We somehow think we have a better idea. Well, we can't have a better idea if we're also at the same time going to toast our children. So I think there is a sense that we who have kind of the mantle of being the more responsible stewards than what preceded us, even in Web 2, in areas of privacy and censorship and so forth. We're seeing ourselves as an answer to the issues facing the world in so many respects. So to the degree to which I see us as a movement, I think it's very much a part of that movement, and I think the consciousness runs pretty deep, is my sense.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Hi, I'm actually a lobbyist for the aluminium industry, and it's one of the most traditionally power-intensive sectors on the planet. And I was wondering, do you think that blockchain will be deprioritized, or how can it compete with traditional industrial, energy-intensive industries for the same limited amount of renewable power?
Well, this is a question. You raise a very sophisticated question, really. So you are clearly in the industry. It's not just an issue of how much power we use. It's our entitlement to use it in the first place. And this has to be a concern of ours. My favorite example is one of the most progressive presidents in Europe is Bjorn, the president of Iceland. He likes to call himself by his first name, like Cher. So Bjorn said as follows to the Bitcoin miners, says, I can run Bitcoin mines in my country. I've got a lot of geothermal power, for example, or I can open my schools, and I choose my schools. So I do think we also have to be hyper aware that that it's not just a matter of meeting this 5 cents per kilowatt hour and taking as much of the energy as we can. If we are the stewards we say we are of a better approach to ESG, including social and governance. I mean, that's what DAOs were created for. I mean, we do have a strong social and governance positioning in the world as having answers to these sort of questions. We do need to engage with the community, because we're not going to be making any friends at 5 cents a kilowatt hour in hydropower or geothermal to close down all the schools in order to do Bitcoin mining. So we do have to be very conscious of this, and it's a good point you're raising.
Very couple of words of myself. I try to keep it short. So essentially, yes, I think you will not compete with Bitcoin miners because they have unique flexibility that they can locate to very remote environments. They are not necessarily reliant on any sort of sophisticated fiber network. So what we see now is those really looking into opportunities to capture stranded sources that might be, where we talk about smaller projects in the single-digit megawatt scale, lower double-digit megawatt scale. So
Co-location.
Yes. So where you, for instance, co-locate to an upstream oil and gas producer that has, currently a bit of an issue with routine flaring. So, you can build directly your generation infrastructure there, essentially gas engines, right? And you build directly adjacent to it, mining containers. What possibly, and where I can't say too much, AI might be a different topic, right? Because I think also from the aluminum industry, you might be able to, pay a rate that is higher than what a Bitcoin miner will pay, but not necessarily an AI company, because AI currently is pretty much like how much power can you give me and not how much does it cost, at least at the moment. And then there's the entire discussion about the grid, possibly also for the aluminum industry. On-site generation might be a really kind of big topic going forward, possibly, where you say, well, we're trying to put away strain from the grid. We try to diversify our kind of own energy generation, and we have we have a grid access. We have, kind of access to a wind farm. We have solar. We have possibly at some point small modular nuclear reactors, all kind of different things. And I believe that is kind of how the future will look like, because I cannot imagine, as Steven said in the beginning, AI is currently really a race, and it's just the lead times of building new generation infrastructure is just too long. So you need to kind of find ways how to try to make it happen in a sense, and without kind of crowding out all existing industries. For instance, we see it there will be strategic priorities. Some countries says, well, we for instance are not so fond of for instance Bitcoin mining or other sort of load that is not necessarily aligned with strategic priorities. When we think about green steel and possibly green aluminum, then I guess how's it called? So I think you will compete most likely more with AI. I don't see there is a lot of competition with mining because they are really trying to find kind of stranded opportunities that most likely are not a direct competitor to you. But that's kind of my 5 cents on the topic.
Thank you. Can we do one more?
Thank you.